Good evening, welcome. We're just going to give it a couple of secs for more people to join. Sorry for those who joined at 10:02 and got booted out and had to log back in. We had a very slight technical issue, which I'm glad to say has been resolved. We had just under 500 people register for this event, so it'll take a few seconds for everyone to join us. We're ready, as you can see, up at over 320 people joining us tonight, which is fantastic. Great. So I think we'll make a start. Hello and welcome to this joint Yachad and New Israel Fund webinar tonight. For those who don't know me, I am Adam Ogno and I am the Chief Executive of the New Israel Fund in the UK. I have the very easy role of very simply welcoming you all this evening. As I said, we have just under 500 people who registered to join this webinar, and we know a number of other people who are following this on our Facebook streams, which is fantastic. And I think what this staggering number demonstrates is clearly a deep concern amongst those in our community here in the UK over this critical issue of vaccine rollout in the occupied Palestinian territories. Tonight, we'll be discussing what's actually happening on the ground between Israel and the PA, what Israel's legal responsibilities are, and how these fit with the Oslo Accords. We'll be looking well beyond the media headlines that have dominated the debate over the last few weeks to understand the nuance in the moral, ethical, and legal position of Israel. Whilst we won't be directly exploring the vaccine rollout in Israel, the clearly here is a very interesting and more positive story to tell, but I think it's just worth mentioning that for NIF and Physicians for Human Rights and some of our other partners, our work here has been to ensure that the more vulnerable and hard to reach groups within Israel, whether that's asylum seekers, prisoners, or those from minority groups, are not excluded from this impressive rollout. And I think whilst we're not reaching into these issues particularly tonight, I think it's important to give that as part of the opening context. And I'm really, really pleased to say that we have two deep experts on these issues with us tonight in Michael Sfard and Ran Goldstein. And thank you to both of them at what is an incredibly busy time for them both to be with us and also deep into your evenings in Israel. I'll now hand over to Hannah Weisfeld, Yachad's director, to introduce Michael and Ran and to chair the event. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us. And over to you, Hannah.
Thanks, Adam. So the way this is going to work, just to introduce myself, as Adam said, I'm Hannah Weisfeld. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the director of Yachad. And just to echo Adam's words, this is obviously an issue that is kind of concerning people, and just getting to the bottom of what is actually going on is really what we're trying to do here tonight, and to try and untangle very conflicting media stories. The way we're going to do this webinar is that, and I will introduce Ran and Michael in a minute, the three of us are going to have a conversation, and we're going to have plenty of time for Q&A. And what it would be great is if you can post your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom. So you should have on the bottom of your screen a box that says Q&A. If you've got a question, post it in there, and feel free to post them as we're going along, and I will try and incorporate the relevant ones into the bit of the discussion we're having. And anything that doesn't fit, hopefully we can answer in a kind of dedicated Q&A session at the end. I would say, because there are so many people on this webinar and we've already had a load of questions emailed in, there is no way we will be able to answer all your questions. So I apologize now if you feel that your question isn't answered, but we will do our very best. We have with us tonight, as Adam said, two real leading lights in this field. And I'm just going to do a brief intro, which is probably not going to do justice to their work, but we have with us Ran Goldstein, who is the Executive Director of Physicians for Human Rights Israel. And to just explain a little bit about what they do, they work to promote a just society where the right to health is granted equally to all people under Israel's responsibility. Physicians for Human Rights provides access to healthcare through its open and mobile clinics, which I'm sure Ran is going to talk about in a minute, using volunteer medical professionals for people with limited or no access to healthcare. And that includes migrants, refugees, and Palestinian residents of the West Bank and Gaza. And Physicians for Human Rights, and I think this is very relevant to tonight, also works to change policies. So they have a whole advocacy and legal part to their work. And I'm sure we're going to touch on that when we get into the nitty-gritty of the conversation in a minute. Michael Sfard, many of you will have met before at our previous events. Michael always says yes when we ask him, which we're very grateful for. He's one of Israel's leading lawyers, specializing in international human rights law and the laws of war. And he represents a wide variety of Israeli and Palestinian human rights activists and organizations and a whole range of people, and has spent a lot of time litigating in the Supreme Court. Some of you will have read his latest book, which was published in 2018, called The Wall and the Gate. And if you haven't, I really recommend it. Michael really is like a fountain of knowledge. And the reason we asked him tonight is because if you want to understand the kind of intricacies of the legal issues, there isn't really a better person who can explain them. I'm going to get going just by asking Ran, if you could maybe just explain briefly to us how healthcare is administered to Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, and who's responsible for it.
So good evening, good night in Israel, and thank you, Hannah, thank you, Adam, Yachad, and NIF UK for this opportunity, and thank you everyone for joining us. I'll start maybe with a story about what's going on in Gaza, and sorry for focusing more in Gaza, but we can elaborate a little bit about the West Bank later if you like. You know, one of the problems in Gaza with the epidemic, with the COVID, was to enforce restrictions on the population because of the bad situation, the very difficult economical situation in Gaza. And really lately, the government, the authorities decided to put police officers outside of houses of people who need to be in quarantine. You know, all of us from time to time need to be in quarantine. And in Gaza, people, you know, didn't obey to the quarantine, and they had to put police officers outside of the houses. And really, one of the families, 10 people in this family, need to wait in the houses in the quarantine, and the police officers were outside. One day, nobody went out. The second day, nobody went out. Then, you know, they said, okay, we'll go inside and see what's going on. And out of those 10 people who need to be inside, only 5 stay in the house, and the other left from a hole in the wall for walk. So people do, you know, in Gaza, whatever they can to leave the house to go to work because of the economical situation. And the economical situation goes in very direct with the medical situation and the healthcare system in Gaza and the West Bank. I can say that in Gaza, a lot of the medical teams didn't get salaries for a very long time. And it's supposed to be one system, but it's split between the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza. And in aim to go between those areas, people need to get a permit. So if you're a patient in Gaza and you need to go to a treatment outside of Gaza, you need to ask for a permit. And if you are a patient in Ramallah and you need to go to East Jerusalem, you need to get a permit. It's easier to get a permit from the West Bank to East Jerusalem or to Israel, but it's very difficult to get a permit to go outside from Gaza. And a lot of services are not really, they don't have a lot of the services in Gaza in the hospitals. So even if, you know, the Palestinians want to or try to be more independent in their health system, however, they are really depend on the international community, the World Health Organization, who contribute a lot. Then we also go, you know, from time every month. It was before the COVID every month, but since the COVID, last month we entered first time since the COVID with the medical delegation. We go to Gaza, and when we go to Gaza, we do an operation in the theater rooms. We do training for the medical teams who are not allowed to go outside for training, or very difficult to get permit to go outside for training. And one of the doctors who do this kind of surgeries in the hospitals told me that when he do surgery in Gaza, and he compared to what he does in his hospitals, in Rambam Hospital, it's like he walked 30 years, it's like 30 years ago. So, and in Gaza, you have around 50% of the medical equipment and drugs are missing in the warehouse. And as for the COVID, for example, last month, they had to stop all the testing for one day because they didn't have enough testing kits, and it took time until they had new testing kits arrive in Gaza. Obviously, they cannot function by themselves, not in the West Bank, not in Gaza, and they need international help. And as what we think and other many human rights organization, and we stated it publicly with another 20, actually, human rights organization from Israel, Palestinians, and around the world, that actually Israel is responsible for supporting, the Palestinians fighting the COVID and also for vaccine.
Thank you. So I wondered if we could just expand on that a little bit, Michael, just this question of who is legally responsible. I don't know if you can kind of spell out for us who, I guess as simply as you can, under international law, who is responsible and how does that kind of practically work?
Thank you, Hannah. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for having us. It's really exciting being with so many people and on such an important topic. And thank you all for making the time. In order to understand the legal reality and the division of responsibilities in the region, one has to acknowledge that the Palestinian territories are under occupation. And occupation is a status under international law. And Israel is the occupying power. And that means that Israel has many obligations. It also has many powers, but many obligations towards the occupied people. There is no dispute that the West Bank is under occupation. And I will say a few words about Gaza in a moment. The spoiler is that I think that I and the international community and most scholars and most international organizations and most of the international community still believe that also Gaza is under occupation. That means that Israel retains the overall responsibility for all aspects of life of Palestinians in those territories, including health. It does not mean that it has to provide the service directly by itself. In fact, international laws of belligerent occupation do allow the occupying power to make use of local institutions and local authorities in order to supply the health services that the population needs. So the PA, if the PA is able, willing and able, and have the funds, the Palestinian Authority, PA, to provide vaccination to all the Palestinian population, that's great. The problem starts when it seems that the PA is either unable or unwilling. We heard from Ran now about Gaza. Gaza has more than 2 million people living in this small area, small strip. And it is clear that the Hamas is not able, the Hamas de facto government is not able, and I'm not sure how much it is desires to provide all these services. Probably it does, but I don't know if it probably cannot do that by itself. So under international law, Israel has the overall responsibility. The Geneva Convention spells out specifically health and even more specifically the fight against pandemics as something that the occupying power is under obligation to provide services for the occupied population. Now, I know that people ask themselves, what is in this case, what is the role of the PA? And didn't we pass responsibility to the Palestinian Authority in the Oslo Accords? The answer is no. The answer is that the PA is not a state, is not a sovereign. The Oslo Accords that were signed, the interim agreement in 1995, created a kind of temporary self-rule that gets its powers from the military government, the military occupation government. And it was supposed to be for 5 years. Israel and the PA and the PLO were supposed to start negotiations on a permanent status in 1996 and reach some kind of agreement before the end of the millennium, and it didn't do it. So we are in this very bizarre situation where an agreement that was supposed to be for 5 years lasts now 25 years. And that agreement did not end the occupation. None of the parties claimed that. and it was not supposed to end the occupation. It was supposed to allow some very limited self-rule. And to be honest, if one inspects the powers of the Palestinian Authority, I think the mayor of London has more powers than the president of the Palestinian Authority. And there's a good reason for that, if I can just elaborate on one more point. Responsibility comes with powers. And, like each one of us that has kids tell their children, if you want to be independent, you have to take responsibility. And why is that? Because only when you are independent, and when we talk about states, when you have sovereignty, you have all the powers you need in order to plan the future of your community. Palestinians have no such thing. They do not have civil rights, political civil rights that allow them to control their fate. They cannot plan the future. The PA does not have the ability to sign international agreements, to get into deals with pharmaceutical companies without Israel's active consent. It does not have the ability to control the territory because, as you know, the PA is an archipelago of islands, of areas A, B, and C, and all of that. So even if the PA would have a perfect plan, 10 years ago, how to plan for a potential pandemic one day, it does not have the tools to carry that out. This is why responsibility still rests with Israel. And one last thing, Israel has not only an occupation in the West Bank, now I'll focus on the West Bank, but also it has about 500,000 citizens, nationals living there, the settlers. And so even if you think that it is okay for Israel to provide a different service for vaccinations, for example, to its nationals inside Israel, making a distinction between its nationals and Palestinians in the West Bank is a clear violation of international law, because this is a clear discrimination. If people in the settlement of Tkoa, there is such a settlement called Tkoa, can go today to their nearby clinic and be vaccinated against COVID, and their neighbors in the Palestinian village of Tkoa, yes, there are two Tkoas, one Palestinian, one Israeli, do not have any access to vaccinations. And they all live in the same geopolitical territory under the same military government. That is discrimination, institutional discrimination, and maybe another word comes up to mind when you think of different laws and different services to different people according to their national affiliation.
Can I just pick up on one, just to press you on one point? You said that the Palestinian Authority needs the active consent of Israel to enter into a vaccine deal even. Can you just explain a little bit more what you mean? But why would they not? Because some of the questions coming in here are about the autonomy that the PA has. So are you saying that the PA doesn't have the autonomy to even go and source its own vaccines?
The Oslo Accords provide Israel with a veto power on almost anything the PA wants to do. And when it comes to medical equipment, pharmaceutical goods, this is something that goes through Israel with Israel's consent. Let's not forget that Israel controls all the borders, it controls all the crosses, and there is just no physical way for the Palestinian Authority to get medicine and vaccinations in without Israel being part of that process. And I will use that moment to say that Gaza, in Gaza, Israel does not have permanent land presence. That's true. But it controls the airspace, it controls all the borders, all the crossings, it controls the who enters and who gets out of Gaza, which goods enter or get out of Gaza. It controls even the population registry in Gaza. I always say that people cannot die and are not allowed to be born without Israel's approval, without being registered by the Israeli authorities. So while it's a different type of occupation, it's not the same as in Ramallah. And by the way, Ramallah occupation is not the same as in the Sin zone. There are different shades of occupation, but it's all occupation, which means that Israel has the overall responsibility, legal, of course moral, but also legal responsibility.
And maybe I will just add about that. So if you want to use a vaccine, for example, which is not authorized in Israel, like the Russian vaccine. So according to, and we'll go back probably a lot of time in this conversation to the Oslo Accords, but you're not allowed, the Palestinians are not allowed to use this vaccine without if it's not authorized in Israel. However, what we know that Israel will allow the Palestinians to use this vaccine, the Russian one, and actually yesterday the PA, the government authorized the Russian vaccine. So maybe they will start and use it in a couple of months, or maybe we know about the end of this month that they might get the first, we don't know if it will be the Russian one or the AstraZeneca one vaccine. This is the two companies we know they are in negotiating with. However, when we spoke with the Israelis on that issue, and we raised this issue that how come the Palestinian will use the Russian vaccine when it's not authorized in Israel, they say, what do you want? They can, it's their will, we're not interfering, how come you say, because it's a bit hypocrisy, they want to be independent, why you enforce us now not to allow them to use the Russian vaccine? And I'm saying that the Palestinian wants to be independent in so many other ways, roads, for example, water, many other problems. And suddenly, with the vaccine, Israel allowed them to use the Russian vaccine, which is obviously because Israel doesn't want to supply the Palestinian with the same vaccine as we received the Pfizer one now, maybe the Moderna in a couple of days.
So can I just pick up on that? Because I think one of the issues here is that there is media report after media report after media report saying completely contradictory things. And I wondered if you could help everybody in this conversation just understand what actually is happening. Because originally, what was reported in the media was that the Palestinian Authority turned down an offer of help, that they didn't want, I don't know if they turned down an offer of help, but they said that they didn't want Israel's help with the vaccinations. And the reason that a lot of people here have been very exercised by the accusation leveled at Israel that it's ignoring the Palestinians in the vaccine rollout is because what was reported in the media was that the Palestinian Authority said, we don't want your help, we're sourcing our own vaccines from the Russian vaccine and others. And then it was reported on Sunday, I think, that, well, I'll just read you a quote for those on this webinar who have not heard it. So on Sunday, the Palestinian Foreign Ministry said that Israel had been, and this is a quote, ignoring its duties as an occupation power and committing racial discrimination against the Palestinian people, depriving them of their rights to healthcare. The search by the Palestinian leadership to secure the vaccines from various sources doesn't exempt Israel from its responsibilities towards the Palestinian people in providing vaccines. So there seems to have been kind of, at least publicly, I don't know what's going on behind the scenes, but at least publicly, there seems to have been a kind of shifting of what the public, what's being said in public about what's actually going on. And I just wondered if you could kind of untangle for us what is actually in reality happening here. Are the Palestinians procuring their own vaccines, or are they asking Israel to do it and Israel is saying no? Because it's not very clear really what's actually happening on the ground.
Okay, so I will try to put some, light on those different, let's say, quotes and approaches, and from what we know, which part of it is true, part of it probably not. So, and first of all, I must say that there is a lot of disinformation. In the media. We speak directly with the Israeli Ministry of Health, with the Palestinian Ministry of Health, and unfortunately, and I can say at least what I thought in the beginning, both sides don't want to be seen as someone who give help to the others or ask for the help from the others, because Israel internally, it won't help to the Netanyahu government if you will say, we're helping the Palestinians, giving them vaccination while we don't have enough vaccination in Israel. And the Palestinians don't want to look like someone who asked for this vaccination from Israel. So it play for both sides, not to be seen as someone who really wants, this cooperation. However, since the COVID started, there is a cooperation between the Israelis and Palestinians, not as much as we want, and we think Israel should provide much more aid, or it's not aid, it's obligations, but provide much more equipment, for example, to the Palestinians to deal with the pandemic. However, lately, and it was in the Independent, beginning of this week, I think Saturday, there was a quote from the head of the WHO in East Jerusalem, who said that they asked from Israel to provide vaccinations for the medical teams in Palestine, and Israel refused. And this is something that, according to the WHO, and I believe them that they asked and Israel refused. However, we know that some 10, 20, the Palestinians say 20, the Israel say a bit more probably, did transfer from Israel to the Palestinian side, but it's nothing, of course, 20 or even 100.
Just to be clear, 20 vaccines, right? 20 doses.
Yes, yes, it's nothing, of course. And as far as we know now, it's true that the Palestinians are waiting for those vaccinations that come out from abroad. It's not the Israeli one. However, we know that there is, this Russian vaccine, and we know, and now it's a little bit of speculations, but with some information behind it. As we know, Israel, also Hadassah Hospital, bought 1.5 million the Russian vaccine. And maybe this is going to be the one that Israel will transfer to the Palestinians. We don't know if it will happen or not. But unfortunately, both sides are playing this political game. And we think in the end, the population are the one who's suffering. And I think it should be much more transparent. And, Israel really enjoy a very good, public relation in the last few weeks about this vaccine operation. And we are the first in the world with, more than 20% of the population already took the vaccination. And I think now when you put this high number of Israelis who already had this vaccination, and you see that no one from the Palestinian side had it, obviously Israel needs to do something. It's not only legally, it's also, for Israel, it's very important. The PR of Israel is very important. But also, and Michael mentioned it a little bit when he spoke about the settlers. So if Israel wants to finish this pandemic, they must guarantee that also in Gaza and the West Bank, there will be people with vaccination, because, it's Palestinian workers are coming to work inside Israel. Israelis are going to the West Bank. Gazan people are coming to Israel, not a lot, but to hospitals and to East Jerusalem. So it's not like, you cannot block these borders, which are not real borders. And in the end, Israel will have, I think, to give vaccination to the Palestinian, and as soon as possible.
So can I just, and I want to come to one final question, and there are hundreds of questions here, so I don't know how we're going to get through them, but
Michael can stay all night, by the way.
just to pick up on one thing. If both of you are saying, and I don't want to, the interpretation of what both of you are saying is that actually Israel does have a responsibility, and that the kind of media, I guess the kind of conflicting media reports are a kind of political thing that's going on. But in reality, Israel has got a responsibility to deliver these vaccines. What would it look like if Israel had said, okay, we're now going to vaccinate the entire population that lives under our jurisdiction, which is, throughout the entirety of the West Bank, the Gaza, and Israel inside the Green Line? What would that mean? A mass vaccination program, and who would be delivering it in Gaza, and who would be delivering it in the West Bank?
This is not a question for a lawyer. I can only say whose responsibility, where does the responsibility lie? And it lies with Israel to make sure that people in the West Bank and in Gaza are being vaccinated and are being treated for COVID. That's as simple as that. There is, it's almost like the basics. It's occupation 101. You can't have all the powers and all the autocratic powers a military government that has no separation of powers. Primary legislation is by a general signing an order, military courts, things that you would not have in any liberal democracy. And at the same time, you exempt yourself from the responsibility to take care of the people. Then who will take care of them? If there was if Palestinians would be hungry for bread, Israel would be responsible, and Israel would have the obligation to feed them. It is. I mean, I'm sorry that I have to talk about the law. It's simple morality. I am my brother's keeper, but if we need to go there to international law, then there is a clear obligation, and it rests with us. Now, can the PA do it? Wonderful, of course, that's great. But if the PA is not able to do it, then Israel has to do whatever it takes so that the PA could do it. And Gaza, that is not only occupied, but also under a very cruel siege for 13 years, there is no possibility for the Gazans to have developed any kind of modern health apparatus. Israel is responsible for Gaza and for the 2 million people that live there. And we have to do whatever it takes to make sure that these people do not all die from the pandemic. It's as simple as that. And if we'll not do it, that's an international crime.
Yeah, and I know.
And sorry, I just want to say, I saw there were people asking about Article 17 of certain annex to the Oslo Accords. Please, the Oslo Accord is a bilateral agreement between the PLO and Israel that was supposed to end 20 years ago. And it has international law of belligerent occupation trumps the Oslo Accords if the Oslo Accords violate the Geneva Conventions. It does not, because that Article 17 is subject to other annexes on economic relationship between the two parties and so on and so on. And eventually Israel has the veto and the overall power to do whatever it wants, and it does whatever it wants in practice.
Thank you. Can we just, Ran, did you want to add something there?
No, just to say that when Israel wants, they know how to work with the Palestinians. We see a suitcase with dollars are coming in. You know, you're not allowed, it's very difficult to transfer money from Israeli bank to bank in Gaza. For example, it's impossible. If I want to pay someone in Gaza work for us and transfer money from our bank account to Gazan bank account, it's impossible to do it in Israel, but money comes with suitcase. It's allowing to go in Gaza, which you cannot track. You know, money between banks you can track. So Israel know how to speak with Hamas. Israel obviously work very closely and know with the medical teams of the PA. Obviously they cooperate. They will find a solution how to give the vaccine, and you don't need Israeli soldiers to do that. Okay, they will find other ways to do that. So, you know, and according to the Oslo Accords, there was also one of the things that I remember when I was young when it was signed, but I really remember very clearly that it was supposed to be a safe passage between Gaza and the West Bank. Everyone, if I remember correctly, Michael, you can correct me, but there was supposed to be also in the Oslo Accord a safe, you know, road between Gaza and West Bank. It's one unit and people should go freely between them. It's not happening. So Oslo Accord, you cannot just use it when it's convenient, you know. That's why, you know, we still see it, and as Michael said, there's a clear occupation in Israel abide according to international law to respect it.
So can I just ask you one question, because a lot of people are asking this and it's relevant now. How does that work in Gaza? So I think that there is kind of an understanding about how that might happen in the West Bank, and we see, as you say, a lot of cooperation between Israel and the PA when they want to. But how would that practically work with Gaza, given the relationship between Israel and Hamas?
Yeah. So first of all, yeah. So maybe first, it's still important to know that the Ministry of Health from Ramallah is the one responsible on Gaza. On the health sector, still the people who works in the hospitals in Gaza, they still they get salaries from Ramallah. So the PA are sending medical equipment, not enough, not as they should, but they do send equipment and medical shipments to Gaza every month, let's say. So obviously, if the PA will receive enough vaccination, they will be able to pass it to Gaza, and Israel already probably, hopefully, will not interfere in the middle. And then in Gaza, I'm sure they will be able to do, and logistic-wise, they will be able to do the vaccination operation. You know, for me, it's obviously you need to leave the closure on Gaza in aim to develop Gaza. This is a very basic thing you need to do. However, you know, do you have enough international community there, and you have enough people who will do it in the hospitals? It's also important to remember in Gaza, half of the population are under 18. So 2 million people, which half of them are under 18. So it's true that the pandemic is very serious, but also, you know, the way to go out from it, probably it's easier than in UK, for example.
Thank you. One final question, and then I'm going to try and pull in some of these questions that we're getting in from our participants, which is the issue with vaccination of prisoners. And I wondered if, Ran, if you could just explain what the situation is with vaccinating Palestinian prisoners that are security prisoners in Israel's prisons, and whether the policy is specific to Palestinians or to Israeli prisoners as a whole.
So, and Michael, of course, you're invited to jump in if you like. So we just filed a petition yesterday to the Supreme Court to get, on Sunday, wow, it looks like yesterday, with other partners like ACRI and Rabbis for Human Rights and Amoked and Adala, because the Minister of Internal Security, Ohana, he said publicly that he will not vaccinate prisoners. In the beginning, he said prisoners in general, not only the Palestinians. Then he wrote in a letter that actually it's just the Palestinian, but later on he spoke about all the prisoners, that he will not vaccinate prisoners before he give it to the prison staff. However, according to the Ministry of Health committee who prioritized the vaccination, obviously they said, in prison, the prisoners and the prison staff, they all need to get the vaccination in high priority. And it's something that all public health experts around the world saying that because in prison, people live in very, you know, in density, like it's very crowded, and the sanitation is not very good, and the staff going out and come in. So it's really important that people in prison will get vaccinations. And, you know, the opinion of the Ministry of Internal Security, it's really his own initiative. So even the Ministry of Health from the same, is still in with, they're still in the same party. So yeah, they're moving all around, those guys. So Edelstein is not Elkin, yeah, that's important to remember. So even the Ministry of Health said publicly that he should follow the rules of the Ministry of Health, but he decided, you know, not to go publicly and say they will not get the vaccination. So we filed a petition to the Supreme Court and some other as well. Hopefully in the next few days, there will be a hearing and let's see what will happen.
I think it's just a very sad analogy to what happens with Gaza and the West Bank. People are incarcerated. They don't have the liberty to take care of themselves. All their freedom is taken away. And then for populist, I can't even explain that reasons. This minister decides that he will not provide very basic, fundamental, and most important health service to those in prison who are at the biggest risk. I mean, the idea was to vaccinate prisoners the same way that the general population is being vaccinated, according to groups, according to the priorities that everyone else is. And the same thing with, I mean, I think this analogy is really sad, and it shows something about this government's way of thinking and how it completely neglects those who are in need and in the more precarious way.
Yeah, maybe it's one sentence. It's important to understand because in UK, I know the health system in prison is not under the prison service, and the doctors are independent. In Israel, it's not the same. The doctors who works in prison service, they're not members in the Israeli Medical Association. They're under the Ministry of Internal Security regime, so they're not really independent, and the prisoners not enjoy the same healthcare as we are outside. And obviously, it's something that hopefully we will be able to change it, because we really push and lobbying that in the end, the Ministry of Health will be in charge, or any other health authority will be in charge for the health of the prisoners, and not the Ministry of Internal Security, which between him and health, there is nothing really.
Thank you. So can I just pick up, I'm just to say to all of you who are participating, I'm going to try and bring in your questions, but there's so many that I'm probably not going to be able to credit you for them. So I'm just going to try and pick up the themes that are coming out here. So a couple of people have asked, because there is just to go back to this Gaza thing, because Egypt has control of one border, does Egypt have any legal responsibility towards the vaccination of the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip? Or is that solely Israel's responsibility?
Do we have an easy way out and just throw it to the Egyptians? The Egyptians do have responsibility, but they don't have the same responsibility as Israel, not even close. The one crossing out of 7 that is not Israeli controlled, but Egyptian in Gaza, is very much affected by Israel, because there is a crossing agreement with Egypt. And so Egypt is not completely, under the agreement, it has to consult Israel on allowing who they allow and who they're not allowed in and out. This agreement had better days and worse days, and during during the Arab Spring, the crossing was more open and then more closed. But I think that the Egyptians do bear some responsibility. They do not occupy Gaza. They have a border with Gaza, and countries that have border with an external territory do bear sometimes responsibility to people who are over the other side of the border. If there is a natural disaster, they need to allow people in, and so on and so forth. But it is not anywhere close to the responsibility that Israel bears, and I don't think it reaches the degree of responsibility that makes the Egyptians responsible to provide vaccines, for example. Absolutely not.
So the other thing that is kind of, I think maybe we could do with kind of untangling a bit, is quite a few people are asking about Palestinians in East Jerusalem who are being vaccinated, and also then asking if there's any difference between who's responsible for what in areas A, B, and C of the West Bank, and does it make a difference? So is it different if you're a Palestinian in Area C versus Area A? And then another question came in earlier about the Golan Heights and how that piece of territory is treated vis-a-vis vaccinations. So I wonder if both of you could maybe have a stab.
Yeah, so I will take the one about East Jerusalem. And then, so no, as far as we know, the Palestinian who lives in East Jerusalem, they do have vaccinations, and they receive it in the health funds they belong to, same as other Israelis. Unfortunately, we're not follow very closely about the figures from this area, but as far as we know, they allowed to receive vaccinations, and it's not the same situation with the Palestinian in the West Bank.
The Israeli responsibility towards the Palestinians in areas A, B, and C is the same. Palestinians who reside in either A, B, or C are all being provided with health services by the PA. And as I said before, if the PA manages well, then that's fine. But if it fails, then the overall responsibility lies with Israel. As for the Golan Heights, under domestic Israeli law, the Golan Heights was annexed. And so it is Israeli territory. of course, a violation of international law, and the international community does not recognize, except the Trump administration. Let's not get into this, but the people who live in the Golan Heights do get vaccinations just like all other Israeli nationals.
Thank you. And Ran, I think this is probably for you. There are people, I know we've touched on this already, but there are people that are still asking kind of for a definitive answer on has the Palestinian Authority, come to the Israeli government and asked for help?
So we also know from the media, unfortunately, we don't know officially if they did it or not. What it doesn't really matter. I think it's Israel's obligation to go and give this support. They don't need to wait until the Palestinians are coming to ask for help. And as I said about the pandemic, Israel did offer in the beginning some help, training to Palestinian medical teams. And I don't know if the Palestinian asked for it or Israel initiated this training, for example. So, and from the other end, yeah, the PA also are not, I assume playing this political game, but it's not, it's like Hamas. Obviously Hamas playing a lot of political game, but you cannot not punish the population in Gaza because of Hamas. You cannot put a collective punishment on Gaza because of Hamas. The same is, so the PAs are ruling, but they're not able to give vaccinations now as we are in Israel. So Israel should take the initiative and work with them closely.
Okay, and we have sorry, no, I thought I might.
And again, I will remind the fact that the WHO said that they asked for vaccinations from Israel for the medical teams, for the Palestinian medical teams, and Israel refused. And the WHO actually represents many times the needs of the Palestinians.
Can I just double down on what Ron said? Because there's also, we have to understand that because the pandemic, also there is a timeline here, and we don't have much time. People are dying, and people might die in accelerated rate if we wait too much. And so Israel cannot just sit down and see, let's see how they cope with it. Maybe in several months, Israel needs to proactively examine what is the situation there, because it has to, even if the PA does not ask for help officially.
Can I ask, one of the questions is about what type of assistance Israel needs to give. So I'm just going to read you this question. It says, as Israel has a much more sophisticated medical system than the PA in the West Bank and Hamas in Gaza, although Ran has said that the health system is under the jurisdiction of the PA in Gaza, on what basis does it have the duty to provide adequate coronavirus-related medical care? So is it to the standard it provides for its own population, or to the standard that PA or Hamas could reasonably expect it to provide? And just to follow on, there's another question, which I think is related, which is that the order in which this happens. So does Israel have to, what would your answer be to the question about the order in which who gets vaccinated first? So if Israel's health authorities say our vaccination order priority list is, I don't know, over 80s first, should that then apply to every over 80 within the population under its control? Or is it reasonable, someone is asking, for Israel to vaccinate Israelis and then to move to the Palestinian population?
So as far as what we think is not acceptable that a 20 years old guy, Israeli, will get vaccination before a Palestinian 80 years old. Hopefully I answered the question. And as for the kind of level of medical care, so as for COVID, there is not a real difference because also in Israel, they don't know how to treat COVID. So it's, we don't know about cases from Gaza or the West Bank, except of Saba or Yachad, for example, where we don't know about many cases who suffer from COVID and transfer or been asked to transfer from Gaza or the West Bank to hospitals in Israel. Because in the end, in hospitals in Gaza, if you have the oxygen and the same equipment, you keep people because there is no treatment really for COVID. But in general, yes, we think that if Israel has the in other, let's say, other treatments, when Israel need to help the Palestinians, need to supply the same kind of treatment, and if people in Gaza, for example, need a specific surgery, which is or cancer treatment, which is not exist in Gaza, yes, they should receive it in Israel, and it should not be something that they don't get.
I think, Hannah, the answer to the question, does Israel owe the same quality of treatment to Israeli nationals and to the Palestinians under its control, it is complicated. I do agree that it's complicated. But I think there is a simple answer to another question, which is very relevant. Israel has to provide the same treatment to settlers and to Palestinians. Even if under international law, and I'm not saying there is, but even if Israel does not have the same duty towards its own nationals in Israel as it has towards the Palestinians, it does have some type of a minimum standard that it has to provide the Palestinians, and maybe to Israelis it can elevate above that minimum. But it cannot differentiate between settlers and Palestinians. It's like going to Golders Green and vaccinating only the Israeli nationals there. That's not acceptable.
So just to clarify, because someone's asked this, has Israel vaccinated any settlers? The answer is, of course, yes.
Of course.
Population. So can I just move on to a question here? There are hundreds of questions here, so I'm trying to pick out the ones that I think I kind of linked together. How do Israeli physicians, Israeli doctors, how do they see this? And is there any pushback from the medical establishment that says that we have a set of code and ethics that govern how we deliver medical treatment, and we want to be able to deliver vaccines to the Palestinian population, or we want to be able to deliver proper healthcare to prisoners? How is there any kind of political lobbying, I guess is the question for you, Ran, that comes from doctors?
Yeah, so I'm very proud actually to work in an organization that all our volunteers and the medical team who volunteers with us and the members of our organization support. Obviously, the exactly what you say, that Israel will give the vaccination and also the prisoners equally with everything. As for the prisoners, yes, we heard many from the medical health establishment saying that, or even publicly said that they disagree with Minister Ohana. As for the Palestinian, it's a bit more complicated and a bit more even sensitive. Yesterday, there was a radio item about there is a source in the Ministry of Health who said that Israel should start and supply vaccination to the Palestinians, but no official, or at least I didn't hear any official, from the Israeli government or any Israeli, even from the Israel Medical Association, who said publicly Israel obliged to vaccinate the Palestinians. Obviously, our members and our volunteers who work in Israeli hospitals, some of them very senior, they support it.
And I lost my next question. So I guess a lot of people are also asking here, bearing in mind everything you've just said, when are Palestinians likely to get a vaccination? How far behind Israel are they in practical terms?
As far as we know, the beginning of February, maybe they will start to get the vaccination. So Israel will be, let's say, at least 20% of the Israelis will get the second vaccinations already when the Palestinian will start.
And just to clarify this point, because I think there's still quite a lot of confusion here, those vaccines will have got to the Palestinian people how? Who will have brought them into the West Bank and Gaza? The Palestinian Authority with the approval of Israel, or Israel?
No, the Palestinian Authority with the approval of Israel, the Palestinian Authority with the help of the, I don't know if it will be Qatar or other country and international community, they will pay for it, and Israel will allow it to come inside.
generous.
And it's worth adding that the PA have also signed up to COVAX, which is the international kind of fund that will.
Yeah, but it's only covered 20% of the.
Which covers exactly 20% of low-income countries' vaccines, which is administered through the WHO and a kind of conglomerate. So vaccines will also come via there too.
It's also important to say that Israel also will contribute to COVAX as well as part of COVAX, and they are on the rich countries, and they will pay for COVAX.
Yeah, and actually the UK is one of the biggest, as an aside, is one of the biggest international contributors to COVAX, which is a positive thing. We are running out of time, and I could ask you millions more questions, but I'm loath to do that because I think people's concentration is going to wane. So I'm just going to take a couple more from here, and then we're going to wrap up. So there is a question. So people are asking about Arab citizens inside Israel and Bedouins as well, and how and what treatment they're receiving. Are they getting access to vaccines in the way that Jewish Israelis are, and how is it being received?
Yes, so they do get access to vaccination as Israelis. In the beginning of the COVID, we saw more problem with the way they inform about, the information, how to deal with the COVID, with restriction, with the different, measures you need to take. However, now I think, you even see many Jewish Israelis who are going to get vaccinations in Arab villages. So yes, they do receive the same.
Okay, and then one final one here, which is that and I guess, Michael, this is to go back to you, and then we are going to draw this to a close, which is, where does Israel's legal obligation end? So is it to supply the vaccination? Is it to supply training? At what point does Israel say, we've done our bit and now it's up to you, the PA? Medical treatment for people that are suffering, presumably, well, we know this, that there are not ventilators. Well, there's, I think, a couple of ventilators in Gaza. Where does Israel's obligation start and end in terms of how far it goes in delivery of kind of pandemic response?
So whoever is eager to end Israel's responsibility should fight to end the occupation. When the occupation will end, Israel's responsibility will end with it. As for the degree or the of health that Israel is bound to provide, it is set in international law of human rights. The right to health is one of the recognized basic human rights under international laws of human rights. And Israel is bound to provide the same degree of health to the occupied population as all other countries are bound to provide to their citizens. And the question of what exactly does it mean, training, it's all of that. It's all of that. And to provide a decent, reasonable health. If we end here, I just want to mention, in 1991, in the first Gulf War, Israel started dispatching gas masks out of fear that Saddam Hussein will fire rockets with gas munition. The army that dispatched the gas masks to the population did not dispatch also gas masks to the Palestinians. And Israel, and there was a high court petition back then in 1991, and the high court has ruled in a matter of seconds, really, it was a very short hearing, that if Israel dispatches gas masks to settlers, which live in the same territory and are the same risk of getting hurt by the Saddam weapon, then Israel is bound to provide each and every Palestinian also gas masks. I wonder if today's court would have ruled the same way. And I think this is very telling about Israel's responsibilities. Of course, the Palestinian Authority was created later on, but as I explained, it can also be a middle, it can only provide the services, and if it does not, Israel still is responsible for providing it.
Thank you. I lied. I'm going to ask you one more question. I'm going to ask you two more questions, one which is a very short answer. But before I get to the very short one, quite a few people here have asked, and I feel that I should ask you this, what you feel that those that are listening to this webinar could be doing to help change this situation. And one person specifically, I'm going to read it because it's quite eloquently worded. He says, what's the best form of collective action to persuade our leaders in this community to mount a campaign to hold Israelis to their moral and legal obligations? So I should preface that by saying, not everybody on this webinar is quite clear from the Q&A box is convinced that Israel has an obligation here, but for those who are, what would you like to see them do in response to what you've said?
So I'll start because I have two and I think Ran would like mine. The first is make sure that this discussion is not silenced, because it's a legitimate criticism that is leveled against Israel and it has to be heard. You don't have to agree. You should, but you don't have to agree with the criticism, but you have to make sure that no one silences this kind of criticism under pretext of, I don't know, anti-Semitism or whatever. Second, support Physicians for Human Rights.
Yeah, I'll support the second one, yeah, obviously. Also the first one, actually. And also, whenever you can, I think you can write, you have the Israeli embassy in UK. You have the people that you can contact and make it publicly, make this pressure. I think in the last, as you said, Hannah, in the beginning, it's a really public discussion lately abroad and also in Israel. And I think it's important to keep going until it will happen.
Thank you. And my final very quick question is, have either of you actually been vaccinated? We've been speaking for the last hour about you've had yours.
Yeah, we have a clinic. Yeah, we have a clinic in our offices in Physicians for Human Rights in Jaffa. We have a clinic. We treat everyone who's statusless in Israel, refugees, asylum seekers, can be Palestinian who escaped from the West Bank or Gaza. And since we have a clinic, everyone in our clinic got a vaccination.
I'm probably not connected enough in the right places. I didn't get any vaccine.
You can come and volunteer in our clinic, Michael. We need legal experts to give treatment to people in the clinic.
Okay, we're gonna end it here because we could carry on talking all evening. But I guess we should just end by saying this, which is that sometimes the contents of these discussions are quite difficult, and I think that people are quite upset by them or even quite angry by what they hear. But I think what is amazing, and actually this is an amazing, a positive thing that has come out of COVID, is that we can bring amazing people like Ran and Michael into your living rooms very easily and very quickly. And, were we not all in lockdown, it wouldn't be so simple and it wouldn't be so quick. And actually, I only asked them both like 4 or 5 days ago if they would be around to do this. And they both willingly said, it's fine, it doesn't matter that it's going to be really late at night in Israel. We really want to speak to your audiences. Mm-hmm. And so I would ask everybody to join me in thanking you, but you won't hear them and you won't see them. But I'm sure that I am echoing everybody else, and there's been 400 people on this webinar, in saying that we are really so grateful, for the really important work that you do every day in fighting for the values that so many of us care about, but also that you then find the time at nearly 10 o'clock at night to come and tell us about it. So thank you so much. And to all of you listening, just to echo what Michael said, that this is not a conversation to be silenced. This is a conversation that we should be having quite loudly. You can find this recording on our Facebook page. The webinar will be up there and you can send it to other people. I think the first 5 minutes might be missing, but most of it is there. And if you want other people to hear what we've discussed tonight, you can get on our Facebook page and you can share the link. And I believe it's also on the New Israel Fund Facebook page. So thanks to everyone for participating, and thank you to Ran and Michael. And then I'm going to now very ungracefully eject you all from this room. So it's going to be a very abrupt ending. So good night, everybody, and hopefully we'll see each other in person soon. Bye, everyone.